I was working a late night shift at the diner I worked at for a year. It was a rainy night. In fact, it was pouring. Nights like these usually meant less customers because people aren't exactly rushing to drive in the rain. I was expecting a slow night. It was for the most part. I was working until midnight. At some point closer to the end of my shift, in came a man and a woman significantly younger looking than him. He looked about 40. She looked like she were in her 20s. They both looked at me the second they walked in, and so I went over to greet them and ask how many. They said just 2, so I brought them to a table. They took a while to order, and I noticed they were talking really quietly to each other. After they did order, the man started striking up a conversation with me. I'm a generally talkative person, which was why I've always thrived in the hospitality industry. So I started chatting their ears off since it was a slow night anyway. Typical waitress-customer back and forth. The girl oddly didn't say much. The man did most of the talking, so I started directing my questions more to him. I can't remember every last thing we said to each other, obviously, but one thing that stuck in my head was when the man asked me, "Do you live alone?" I did live alone, and still do live alone. I answered his question honestly, saying I live about 10 minutes north up the road, and that it's really quiet and boring around here. At the time, I didn't see his question as any kind of red flag, albeit maybe a bit strange of a question. But something about a man being with another female makes you automatically assume they're not a threat. I made jokes about being stuck here forever and such, and then walked away from the table. I'd say about 45 minutes later, they finished and left. Fast forward probably an hour later, and we were closing up the place. I said goodbye to my coworkers and rushed to my car to avoid getting more soaked than I needed to from the rain. It was still pouring outside. I drove home slow because of the conditions. The second I got home, I ran straight to the front door and let myself in. I didn't even notice that neither of the other tenants' cars were parked outside. My living situation was the middle floor of a home with 3 apartments in it. There's a side entrance with a stairway that has an entrance to all 3 floors. My being on the first floor meant that I could enter through the front door. After setting my keys and stuff down on the kitchen counter, there was a manic pounding at the front door. It was nearly 1 a.m. I had no idea who it could be besides maybe one of the other tenants in the house. There's 2 doors, the glass storm door and the inner door. I always keep both locked for safety. I opened the inner door and saw a girl on the other side of the storm door. She was drenched. She was wearing a gray sweater with the hood up, partially obscuring her face. She begged me through the door to let her in so she could use a phone. Before doing that, I first had to feel her out, of course. I asked her if she's lost. She replied that a creepy man was following her around and she needed help. Something about this girl, though, was strikingly familiar. I asked her who the man was and where he was. She turned around and then said, "I don't know." She kept begging me to open the door. She even tried opening it herself. I then realized why she looked familiar. She looked like the girl from the diner that was with that man. So I asked her straight up, "Weren't you at my diner before?" She didn't acknowledge my question. Maybe she didn't hear me, but she turned around once again and started freaking out, pounding on the door, saying, "There he is." I looked beyond her to the street, and I saw a large man slowly walking towards the house. As the man slowly got closer, the girl kept looking at me with a look that would imply she's more confused than anything as to why I'm not opening the door. The man got close enough for me to realize I was right. It was that man from the diner, and this was the girl sitting with him at the diner. I think she saw it in my eyes the moment I realized, and she turned to the man and screamed, "Go!" The man started charging at the door, and I slammed the inner door shut and locked it. I didn't hear any kinds of knocks or bangs. I wasn't about to open the door again to check if they were still there, though. I went to the stairway to go upstairs and knock on the upstairs tenant's door. The stairway is separated from the 3 apartments by a door on each level. After knocking a bunch of times, nobody answered. I tried the same thing at the downstairs door. No answer either. This was when I looked out the windows and realized none of their cars were here tonight. I was alone in the house. I went back up to my apartment and then locked the stairway door. My mind was racing, conjuring up possible explanations. The most obvious explanation was that it was a trap to get me to open the door so that they could rob me, or worse. It suddenly made sense why that man asked me if I lived alone. I had to just sit on the couch for a few minutes and think. All I could hear was the sound of the pouring rain outside. I thought about calling the police, but chose not to in that moment. After a few minutes, I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth and get ready for bed when I heard a knocking sound. I left the bathroom to listen, and I was right. It was a knocking sound. It was coming from the stairway door. I walked over to it, thinking it was one of the tenants. I said, "Who is it?" There was no verbal response, but whoever it was knocked again. I said both of the other tenants' names. No response. The only thing I could say is, "If you don't identify yourself, I'm calling the police." I practically screamed it. They heard me for sure. They knocked once again. So I yelled, "What do you want?" And a voice from the other side said, "Your blood on me." I ran to my room and locked myself inside and called the police. I hid in my closet while I was on the phone, and I stayed in there. The sounds of the rain, wind, and thunder outside constantly startled me. I worried about any little sound coming from inside the house. It was the longest 10 minutes of my life before I was told to let the police inside the house at the front door. They wrote a report of everything. They checked the front and backyard. Then they suggested I find another place to sleep for a few nights. I took that advice and packed a bag real quick while they were there, and then left to drive to my parents' house for the night. I returned the next day to the house. There was a knock at the stairway door, and this time it was actually my neighbor from upstairs. I opened the door, and he pointed at the door and asked, "What's this about?" I was horrified to see a message on the door saying, "Thanks for the service, Beth." It was written in marker. I couldn't stay there for a while. I had to stay with my parents for a few weeks until this blew over. I got a new apartment pretty close by the following month. Better safe than sorry.